Chapter 1, The Graveyard Shift. The world at 2 a.m. possessed a distinct, heavy silence, a weight that existed only when the rest of the city surrendered to sleep. Inside the studio of Wavelengths 94.2, that silence was held at bay by the soft, rhythmic hum of electronic equipment and the amber glow of the console meters. Julian sat in the center of this insular universe, his fingers resting lightly on the smooth edge of a vintage turntable. The room smelled of old paper sleeves, heated vacuum tubes, and the faint, bitter ghost of chicory coffee from a mug that had grown cold hours ago. Outside the triple-pane soundproof glass, the city of winter stone and iron stretched toward a frozen river, its street lamps blinking like dying stars through the December haze. To the thousands of insomniacs, night workers, and drifting souls tuned in, Julian was merely a comforting cadence, a nameless companion guiding them through the dark. To Julian, however, the radio booth was both a sanctuary and a self-imposed exile, a place where he could curate the emotions of the world without ever having to step directly into the light. He reached for a worn cardboard jacket, carefully sliding a thick, heavy slab of vinyl onto the platter. With a practiced, fluid motion born of a decade of solitary midnights, he dropped the sapphire stylus into the outermost groove. The initial crackle, the warm, textured breathing of the record, filled his heavy studio headphones before the first melancholy notes of a forgotten cello suite began to bleed into the airwaves. Julian watched the green needles of the decibel meters dance across their small glass windows, measuring the precise volume of his loneliness. This was the ritual that kept him anchored while the calendar marched steadily toward Christmas. Around him, the walls were lined with thousands of albums, a fortress of melodies meant to protect him from the stark reality of the daylight hours, where faces blurred and human connections seemed to slip through his fingers like dry snow. He leaned back in his leather chair, closing his eyes, letting the music fill the gaps in the quiet room, wondering how many people on the other side of the transmitter were looking out at the same dark sky, searching for the exact same unspoken comfort. Chapter 2, The Glass and the Frost. The skeletal iron ribs of the grand conservatory arched over the dark garden like the ribcage of a sleeping leviathan, catching the pale, filtered light of the winter moon. Inside the structure, the temperature was a carefully guarded secret, a fragile pocket of tropical warmth maintained by a network of clanking steam pipes that hissed softly into the humid air. Diana stood on a rusted iron scaffolding 3 feet above the damp earth, a charcoal pencil held tightly between her soil-stained fingers. Her breath materialized in faint, fleeting ghosts whenever she leaned too close to the cold glass perimeter where the external December air fought against the interior heat. Before her stretched the canvas of her grandest project, the Winter Conservatory, a massive, ambitious botanical display designed to bloom in a brilliant, synchronized symphony of reds, deep burgundies, and soft creams precisely on Christmas Eve. Yet, with the holiday looming less than 3 weeks away, the earth felt stubborn, the root balls reluctant, and the grand design remained locked inside the frantic sketches of her leather-bound notebook. She adjusted the collar of her heavy wool sweater, stepping down from the scaffold into the rich, dark loam below. The scent of the space was intoxicating and complex, a mixture of crushed pine needles, damp peat moss, decaying bark, and the sharp, clean note of distant wood smoke drifting in from the surrounding valley. Diana thrived in this isolation. She had always found the predictable, silent growth of flora far more comforting than the chaotic, unpredictable nature of human relationships. People demanded explanations, they offered empty promises, and they walked away when the seasons shifted. Plants, however, spoke in a language of pure patience and physical truth. She knelt beside a bed of rare winter orchids, her fingertips gently brushing the velvety underside of a dormant leaf, checking the moisture levels with a focused, almost meditative intensity. The world outside this glass bubble was rushing blindly toward the festive season with glittering lights and loud celebrations, but here, time moved with a slow, deliberate crawl. Diana felt the heavy weight of expectation pressing down on her shoulders, knowing that the success of the garden's grand opening rested entirely on her ability to make life flourish where the frost demanded death. She looked up at the vast expanse of the glass ceiling, watching a fresh flurry of snowflakes begin to dance against the panes, feeling beautifully alone in her translucent fortress. Chapter 3, The First Call. The clock above the mixing console clicked forward to 2:47 a.m., its red digital numbers casting a sharp crimson line across the metallic faders. A sudden, heavy rain had begun to wash over the city, turning the distant street lamps into blurred, watery smears against the black backdrop of the night. Inside the studio, Julian was adjusting the equalizer for a low, droning ambient track when the telephone line on the auxiliary deck began to flash, a steady, silent pulse of white light that cut through the dim room. Callers at this hour were usually predictable, lonely truck drivers passing through the state line, anxious students cramming for exams, or sleepless souls looking for a voice to drown out their own thoughts. Julian hesitated for a moment, his hand hovering over the blinking plastic button, before pressing it to route the audio directly into his heavy headphones. There was no spoken greeting, no exchange of pleasantries, and no standard radio introduction. Instead, the line carried only the rich, hollow acoustics of a vast, echoing space, punctuated by the rhythmic, metallic hiss of a distant steam pipe and the soft, deliberate rustle of paper blueprints. Through the static, a melody began to play from the other end of the line, not from a digital file or a polished CD, but from a tiny, tinny speaker of a portable radio playing back Julian's own broadcast into the receiver, creating a strange, haunting feedback loop. Then, the stranger placed a small, mechanical music box directly against the telephone mouthpiece. The delicate, metallic notes of a rare, mid-century European lullaby began to chime, crisp and melancholic, cutting through the low-frequency hum of the radio equipment. In her glass fortress miles away, Diana held the receiver tightly against the brass mechanism of the antique box, her eyes fixed on the distant red beacon of the radio tower blinking through the torrential rain. She didn't want to speak, she simply needed to project a fragment of her internal landscape into the void, to see if the person behind the late-night microphone would understand the wordless frustration of her stalled winter creations. Inside the booth, Julian sat completely still, captivated by the raw, unpolished beauty of the miniature mechanism playing over the line. The melody was one he had searched for in record shops for years, a composition representing complete, beautiful isolation. Without a single word spoken between them, he understood the quiet urgency behind the call. When the music box finally wound down, ending on a single, unresolved chord, the line went dead with a soft click. Julian did not reset the cue. Instead, he bypassed his scheduled playlist, reached into the deep wooden crates beneath his desk, and pulled out a rare, unreleased press of a solo piano track that mirrored the exact emotional weight of the stranger's melody. As the first notes spun out into the wet December night, he knew the anonymous caller was listening somewhere out in the dark, wrapped in the same shared frequency. Chapter 4, Arthur's Silent Advice. The smell of damp wool and industrial floor wax heralded the arrival of the final hour of the shift. Arthur, the station's veteran night engineer, moved through the master control room with the slow, deliberate grace of a man who had spent 40 years watching the city's nocturnal heartbeat through copper wires and vacuum tubes. He carried his signature battered green thermos, its scratched metal surface reflecting the dim blue indicator lights of the main transmitter racks. Through the heavy observation glass that separated the engineering bay from the broadcast booth, Arthur looked in on Julian. The young producer wasn't preparing his usual log sheets or filing away the used vinyl into their respective alphabetized slots. Instead, Julian was hunched over the secondary turntable, gently spinning a record backward and forward with his thumb, his face illuminated by the harsh white glare of a single desk lamp as he tried to match the exact pitch of the melody from the previous night's anonymous call. Arthur entered the booth without a word, the heavy acoustic door sealing behind him with a soft, pressurized thud. He didn't ask about the sudden deviation from the station's strict formatting, nor did he comment on the rare, uncatalogued discs cluttering the workspace. Instead, he placed a thick ceramic mug on the edge of the console, filling it with the dark, thick coffee that had fueled decades of solitary winters. He sat down on the high stool in the corner of the room, pulled a small pocketknife from his trousers, and began peeling a red apple in one continuous, unbroken ribbon of skin. His eyes, framed by deep lines of laughter and sleeplessness, drifted to the logbook where Julian had drawn a crude, hasty sketch of a 5-note musical phrase, the exact sequence from the midnight music box. Arthur reached over, his rough, calloused hand gently tapping the glass of the turntable's speed monitor, then pointed significantly toward the dusty, overlooked bottom shelf of the archive cabinet behind them. It was a wordless gesture, but to Julian, it was a map. That bottom shelf held the station's foundation, the forgotten acetate recordings of the city's earliest broadcasts, full of raw, unfiltered human emotion from an era before digital perfection. Arthur's silent advice was clear: do not look for this stranger in the commercial hits of the present, look for her in the deep, resonant history of the hidden world. The old engineer finished his apple, wiped the blade of his knife on a paper towel, and stood up as the automated morning news broadcast began to queue up. He gave Julian a reassuring, heavy pat on the shoulder, a silent affirmation that some of the most profound conversations in life happened without a single word ever being spoken. Julian looked at the bottom shelf, then back at the flashing console, feeling the cold weight of his isolation begin to melt into a quiet, purposeful curiosity. Chapter 5: The Daylight Mirage. The winter sun at 2 p.m. possessed no real warmth, offering only a flat, blinding glare that reflected harshly off the slush-filled gutters and the stone facades of the market square. To Julian, the daytime city felt like a foreign country. Having spent his night living in a world of pure sound, the sensory overload of the afternoon was jarring: the screech of metal tram wheels, the chaotic chatter of holiday shoppers, and the heavy smell of roasting chestnuts mixed with diesel exhaust. He walked through the dense crowd with his coat collar turned up against the biting wind, a canvas bag of rare vinyl records slung over his shoulder. The daylight hours always made him feel like a ghost walking among the living. The people around him moved with a frantic, purposeful energy that he could not replicate. They were rushing home to families, heading to offices, or buying bright, tinseled decorations, while his own day was drawing to a close, his internal clock permanently set to the quiet rhythm of the stars. A few yards away, navigating the opposite side of the bustling artisanal market, Diana was inspecting a display of thick burlap sacking and winter insulation blankets. Her fingers, still stained with the dark loam of the conservatory, traced the rough weave of the fabric. She was exhausted, her mind spinning with temperature variables and root rot calculations, completely detached from the festive cheer that surrounded her. She hated the afternoon rush, finding the forced joy of the holiday crowd suffocating compared to the silent, predictable sanctuary of her glass house. As she paid the vendor, a sudden gust of wind swept through the square, catching the edge of her large, rolled-up architectural blueprint and sending it tumbling across the icy cobblestones. Julian, stepping off the curb to avoid a delivery cart, saw the cylinder of paper rolling toward his boots. He knelt down, his gloved hand catching it just before it dipped into a puddle of dirty, melted snow. As he stood up to return it, the crowd surged between them, a sea of heavy winter coats, bright red scarves, and oversized shopping bags. He caught a fleeting glimpse of a woman with dark hair and an intense, focused expression, her hands reaching out into the cold air. Diana looked across the gap, her eyes locking for a fraction of a second on a tall man holding her lost plans, his face partially obscured by a thick gray scarf. The space between them was filled with the loud, ringing bells of a passing street car and the shouting of vendors, creating a wall of daylight static. By the time the tram passed, the current of the crowd had swept Diana away toward the florist's stalls, and Julian was left holding the blueprint, entirely unaware that the hand that had drawn those precise ink lines belonged to the very voice that had haunted his radio booth just 24 hours before. Chapter 6: Echoes in the Conservatory. The afternoon light faded quickly, surrendering the sky to a bruised, violet twilight that turned the glass walls of the conservatory into a mirror reflecting the glowing interior. Diana sat at her wooden worktable, her boots caked with dry mud, surrounded by pots of dormant winter jasmine. On the corner of the desk, an old, grease-stained plastic radio, its antenna extended and wrapped in a piece of copper wire to improve the reception, played the station's late-afternoon automated rebroadcast. It was the hour when the station reran selected segments of the previous night's ambient soundscapes for the early evening commuters. Elena, the lead botanist, moved quietly in the background, her shears clicking rhythmically as she trimmed the dead leaves from a row of festive poinsettias, her presence a silent, grounding comfort in the vast, humid space. Diana barely noticed the clipping sound, her attention was entirely anchored to the low, resonant frequency hum leaking from the small radio speaker. The music shifting through the airwaves caught her completely off guard. It wasn't the standard holiday jazz or the cheerful orchestral carols that usually filled the twilight hour. Instead, the voice of the nameless late-night DJ introduced a rare, deep archive track, the very solo piano piece Julian had selected in response to her midnight music box call. As the slow, deliberate chords echoed through the iron beams and bounced off the frosted glass panes, Diana stopped her sketching. The music fit the atmospheric melancholy of the conservatory perfectly, matching the slow, unhurried growth of the root systems beneath the soil. It felt as though the radio operator had looked directly into her mind, translating her creative exhaustion and her quiet hopes into a tangible, auditory landscape. She touched the empty space on her desk where her main blueprint usually sat, a sharp pang of frustration hitting her as she remembered losing it in the chaotic afternoon market. Then, the broadcast shifted. The music faded into a field recording, the raw, unedited sound of a heavy winter rainstorm washing over stone streets, followed by the distant, distinct chime of a miniature music box mechanism. Diana's breath caught in her throat. She leaned closer to the radio, her fingers tightening around her charcoal pencil. It wasn't a coincidence, it was a direct, public acknowledgement of her anonymous midnight call, broadcast across the entire city. Elena stopped her clipping for a moment, glancing over at Diana with a look of quiet curiosity, noticing the sudden, intense focus in her friend's posture, before returning to her work without a word. Diana looked up at the glass roof, where the first stars of the evening were beginning to pierce the violet haze, realizing that while she was physically isolated in her fortress of frost and green, her quiet signal had been received, understood, and echoed back to her through the dark. Chapter 7, A Language of Tracks. By the second week of December, the midnight calls had evolved from a strange, isolated coincidence into a deliberate, unwritten ritual. The telephone on the corner of the audio console no longer felt like a tool for random listeners, it had become an exclusive conduit between two distinct islands in the dark. Every night at precisely 3:15 a.m., the white indicator light would begin its steady, silent pulse, and Julian would immediately slide his headphones over his ears, his hand lowering the main studio fader to make room for the incoming frequency. There were never any words spoken, no introductory greetings, and no names exchanged across the copper lines. Instead, a new, complex language had formed between them, a vocabulary constructed entirely of rare vinyl cuts, obscure field recordings, and the ambient textures of their respective environments. Through the receiver, Julian would listen to the rich, expansive atmosphere of Diana's world, the heavy, hollow patter of freezing rain against a massive glass roof, the rhythmic clanking of ancient steam radiators, or the soft, sweeping sound of a broom clearing soil from stone tiles. In return, Diana would hold her receiver aloft in the middle of the dark conservatory, letting the ambient sounds of her creative struggle drift into the microphone. Julian would absorb these auditory clues like a cartographer mapping an unseen territory. He began to anticipate her moods based on the subtle shifts in the background noise. If the steam pipes hissed aggressively, he knew she was cold. If the silence on her end felt heavy and dense, he knew she was staring blankly at her stubborn, unyielding plans. In response, he would curate his musical selections with surgical precision, sliding a rare acoustic guitar press or a slow, sweeping cello movement onto the turntable to offer comfort, encouragement, or shared patience. In her glass fortress, Diana would lean against a wooden pillar, the small plastic radio at her side painting the humid air with the exact frequencies she needed to hear. She began to recognize Julian's internal state through his sequencing, the way he would let a track fade out completely into a long, reflective silence before introducing a new melody, or the way he would loop a specific, hopeful piano chord when the winter weather outside grew particularly fierce. It was an intense, profound intimacy born of total anonymity. They were two strangers building a shared emotional architecture out of thin air, completely insulated from the chaotic, demanding world that awaited them at dawn, content to exist solely as echoes in each other's solitary nights. Chapter 8, Elena's Observation. The morning light arrived with a sharp, pale clarity, casting long, geometric shadows of the conservatory's iron frame across the worktables. Elena stood by the central potting station, a wooden crate of dormant white amaryllis bulbs at her feet, quietly watching Diana from across the wide aisle. For weeks, the atmosphere in the greenhouse had been defined by a tense, heavy frustration. Diana's movements had been rigid, her sketches sharp and frantic as she battled the unyielding winter elements. But today, a subtle yet profound shift had taken place. Elena noticed the change first in the rhythm of Diana's hands. As Diana carefully loosened the compacted soil around a delicate root system, her fingers moved with a fluid, measured patience that seemed to match the tempo of a song only she could hear. The frantic energy that had threatened to derail the Christmas Eve exhibition had smoothed out, replaced by a deep, meditative calm that filled the immediate space around her. Elena stepped closer, carrying a tray of terracotta pots, her eyes tracking the new architectural sketches pinned to the corkboard above the desk. The sharp, jagged lines of Diana's previous layouts had vanished. In their place were sweeping, circular designs, fluid arrangements of pathways and plant beds that seemed to flow across the paper like musical notation. Elena reached out, her fingers gently tapping the edge of the paper, then looked at the grease-stained plastic radio that now remained permanently plugged into the outlet beside the drafting table. It was a silent observation, a knowing glance from a lifelong friend who recognized that Diana's heart had found an anchor somewhere outside the glass walls. Elena didn't need to ask questions or demand explanations, she simply appreciated the visible softening in her friend's shoulders and the newfound resilience in her posture. As the afternoon sun dipped below the tree line, casting a warm amber glow over the newly arranged flora, Elena quietly took over the physically demanding task of moving the heavy soil sacks, allowing Diana to remain lost in her creative flow. It was an unspoken act of support, a bridge of understanding between two women who had spent years working side by side in the dirt. Elena could see that while Diana was still physically present in the humid, green sanctuary, a significant part of her mind was already waiting for the sun to drop completely, waiting for the clock to strike midnight when the small plastic radio would come alive once more. Chapter 9, The Snowfall Prelude. The clouds descended upon the city in the middle of a Tuesday afternoon, a heavy, slate-gray blanket that entirely swallowed the tops of the tallest buildings and the distant radio transmission towers. Then, the snow began to fall. It arrived not with a violent wind, but with a dense, majestic silence, each massive flake drifting lazily through the frozen air before settling onto the cold stone ledges and the iron fire escapes. High up in the studio tower of wavelengths 94.2, Julian stood with his forehead pressed against the cold glass of the observation window, his breath leaving a small circle of fog on the pane. From this vantage point, the chaotic, noisy city below was being systematically muted, buried under an expanding layer of pure, untrodden white. He watched the cars slow to a crawl, their headlights turning into soft, yellow halos, while the pedestrians became tiny, dark silhouettes navigating a rapidly shifting landscape. The sight filled him with a deep, cinematic sense of peace. He immediately reached for his field recorder, leaning out of a small transom window to capture the unique, muffled acoustic quality that only a heavy snowfall could bring to the urban airwaves, the damp, soft crunch of distant boots, the quiet hiss of tires on fresh powder, and the profound stillness that seemed to wrap itself around the world. Miles away, at the edge of the dark pine forest bordering the botanical gardens, Diana was walking directly through the heart of the storm. Wrapped in a heavy canvas coat with a pair of thick iron shears slung over her shoulder, she moved quietly among the trees, her boots sinking deep into the fresh snow drifts with a rhythmic, satisfying crunch. She was harvesting wild pine boughs, frosted holly branches, and strips of silver birch bark to weave into the base structures of her Christmas Eve display. Unlike the frantic city dwellers rushing for shelter, Diana relished the biting cold against her cheeks. The storm felt like a clean slate, a beautiful simplification of a complicated world. She stopped beneath a massive cedar tree, looking up through the dark, laden branches as the snow drifted into her hair. In that exact moment, she felt a strange, intuitive connection to the quiet architecture of the afternoon, entirely unaware that miles away in a concrete tower, a man was recording the very silence she was walking through. She gathered her fragrant bundle of evergreen branches, their sharp, resinous scent cutting through the crisp air, and turned back toward the glowing glass pyramid of her conservatory. Both she and Julian were moving through the same frozen masterpiece, separated by miles of winter stone, yet perfectly synchronized in their appreciation for the quiet magic that was slowly rewriting the world around them. Chapter 10, The Near Miss at the Coffee Cart. The morning after the heavy snowfall broke with a crisp, blinding blue sky that made the white-capped city streets gleam like polished marble. At 8:30 a.m., a small wooden coffee cart stationed at the intersection near the central library was surrounded by a dense, shifting cluster of early-morning commuters, all bundled in dark wool coats and exhaling thick plumes of white vapor into the freezing air. The air around the cart was a rich, heavy cloud of espresso steam, cinnamon syrup, and the sharp, clean scent of melting ice. Julian stood on the edge of the queue, his eyes bloodshot from the grueling graveyard shift he had finished just an hour prior. His hands were buried deep inside his pockets, his fingers nervously tracing the smooth, cool edge of a rare acetate disc he had unearthed from the station's deepest archives. He moved forward in line with a slow, heavy step, desperately craving the warmth of a paper cup of black coffee to anchor him back to the physical world before he retreated to his dark apartment for the day. At the exact same moment, Diana slipped into the opposite side of the small crowd around the cart. She had spent the entire night tending to a delicate batch of tropical ferns that had threatened to freeze during the blizzard, and her hands were raw and trembling slightly from the biting chill. Her mind was a chaotic grid of temperature logs and layout deadlines, completely detached from the murmuring commuters around her. As the person ahead of her stepped away, she reached out toward the small metal ledge of the cart to grab a bundle of paper napkins just as Julian stepped forward from his side to pick up a morning newspaper left on the counter. Their gloved hands brushed against one another, a brief, unforced point of contact that caused them both to freeze for a fraction of a second. Julian looked up, his gray scarf slipping slightly to reveal his tired, sharp jawline. His eyes locked onto Diana's face, noting the dark circles of exhaustion beneath her striking eyes and the faint smudge of dark greenhouse soil on the cuff of her canvas jacket. Diana looked back, her breath catching as she met the gaze of this stranger whose quiet, calm presence stood out completely from the frantic, rushing crowd. For 3 long seconds, the world around them seemed to lose its soundtrack, the shouting of the street vendors, the roaring of the snowplows, and the chatter of the city vanished into a profound, shared silence. Yet, there was no recognition, only the deep, instinctive curiosity of 2 lonely night souls crossing paths in the harsh glare of morning. A sudden surge of late arrivals pushed between them, a wall of heavy shoulders and bright woolen blankets breaking their connection. Diana stepped back into the current of the sidewalk, turning toward the library gardens, while Julian picked up his coffee and walked toward the subway, both of them entirely unaware that they had just looked into the very eyes of their midnight confidant. Chapter 11, Arthur's Records. The deepest hours of the night always brought a peculiar stillness to the sub-basement vaults of the radio station, a place where the air was thick with the scent of decaying cardboard, iron filings, and ancient wax. Arthur stood before a towering row of steel industrial shelves, a heavy brass flashlight held between his teeth, casting a sharp beam of yellow light into the shadows. While Julian spun his regular sets upstairs, the old engineer had committed his break to exploring the uncatalogued crates that hadn't been disturbed since the station changed its transmitter format back in the late 1970s. His calloused fingers moved slowly across the spines of forgotten shellac discs and thick acetate transcriptions, looking for something specific, a sonic artifact that could match the rare, complex emotion he had seen growing in Julian over the past fortnight. He stopped near a water-stained wooden box marked Miscellaneous Local Broadcasts, 1958. Reaching deep into the back, his hand closed around a heavy, unlabeled sleeve made of coarse brown paper. Inside was a thick, hand-cut acetate record, its surface bearing no printed information, only a faint, elegant inscription etched directly into the center wax with a stylus: Winter Solstice Suite, Solo Harp and Night Wind. Arthur pulled it from the sleeve, holding it up to the bare bulb overhead, inspecting the deep, clean grooves for any sign of warping. He wiped the dust away with the sleeve of his flannel shirt with a slow, reverent motion, knowing instantly that he had found exactly what Julian needed to bridge the widening gap in his nightly conversations. Arthur climbed the winding iron stairs back to the master control booth, the heavy disc tucked safely under his arm. He entered the studio just as Julian was concluding a low, ambient electronics set. Without a single word, the old engineer walked over to the secondary transcription turntable, a heavy, specialized platter built to handle historic formats, and gently laid the acetate down. He picked up a specialized diamond-tipped needle from his pocket, swapped out the standard cartridge with a practiced flick of his wrist, and then pointed a single, steady finger at the record-starting groove. Julian looked up from his log sheets, his eyes tracking Arthur's deliberate movements, feeling a sudden surge of curiosity. Arthur didn't offer an explanation, he simply reached over and adjusted the preamplifier to a specific, warm analog setting, gave Julian a meaningful, heavy nod, and walked back out into the engineering bay. Left alone with the mysterious disc, Julian lowered the needle into the groove, his headphones instantly filling with a sound so pure, raw, and beautifully fragile that it felt like an unmediated broadcast from a soul trapped in a different winter entirely. Chapter 12, Illuminating the Frost. The clock on the iron support pillar click-clacked forward to 3:08 a.m. Inside the grand conservatory, the darkness was complete, broken only by the cold, distant silver of the moon sliding across the frosted glass roof. Diana stood at the master electrical panel, her hand resting on a row of heavy, vintage porcelain toggle switches. She had spent the last 4 hours rewiring the low-voltage lighting grid that snaked through the subterranean root beds and hung suspended from the overhead iron trusses. This was the final technical hurdle for her Christmas Eve exhibition, the synchronization of light and life. Beside her on a wooden crate, the small plastic radio hummed softly, its internal dial glowing a faint, comforting orange in the gloom, casting long shadows across her boots. With a slow, deliberate movement, Diana threw the master breakers. Instantly, the pitch-black cavern of the conservatory transformed into an otherworldly landscape of color. Low, recessed emerald lights illuminated the broad, velvety leaves of the tropical ferns from beneath, making them glow like solid jade. Overhead, a soft, warm amber wash cascaded down from the iron trusses, mimicking the gentle light of a late autumn sunset. At that exact moment, the static on the radio cleared completely, and the rare, uncatalogued acetate recording that Arthur had discovered for Julian began to drift into the humid air. The crisp, crystalline notes of the solo harp vibrated through the small plastic speaker, accompanied by the raw, natural sighing of the night wind captured on the vintage disc decades ago. Diana froze, her hand still touching the metal panel. The music was impossibly beautiful, possessing a textured, fragile depth that standard digital audio could never replicate. As the harpist struck a series of low, resonant chords, the sound seemed to physically interact with the shifting colors of her lighting grid. She walked slowly down the central aisle, her boots making no sound on the damp earth, watching the warm amber and deep emerald lights wash over the sleeping flora. The music didn't just fill the space, it gave her creation a heartbeat. It felt as though the nameless radio operator was sitting right there in the dark with her, translating the quiet, hidden architecture of her soul into a tangible, auditory masterpiece. She knelt beside a cluster of white orchids, watching the soft amber light catch the frost patterns forming on the exterior glass behind them, feeling the crushing weight of her creative isolation melt into a profound, transcendent sense of shared purpose. Miles away, a man was watching a needle spin on a slab of old wax. Here, a woman was watching a garden come to life under the spell of his choices. Chapter 13, Mid-December Melancholy. A fierce atmospheric inversion settled over the valley by mid-December, wrapping the city in a dense, freezing fog that played havoc with radio waves and copper telephone lines alike. Inside the studio of wavelengths 94.2, the air felt thick, charged with an unsettling hum of static electricity. Julian sat rigid in his leather chair, his eyes anchored to the telephone console. It was 3:45 a.m., half an hour past the usual mark, and the white indicator light remained stubbornly dark, an empty plastic square reflecting the cold fluorescence of the ceiling. Outside, the transmission tower groaned softly against a bitter northern wind, its red warning beacon swallowed completely by the gray, soup-like mist. Julian adjusted the auxiliary audio levels, hoping to catch even a faint crackle of an open line, but his headphones delivered only the harsh, unfeeling roar of white noise, a digital blizzard that seemed to mock his sudden, sharp desperation. He reached for a record, but his fingers slipped against the cardboard sleeve, dropping it onto the desk with a flat, hollow thud. The routine that had sustained him for weeks suddenly felt incredibly fragile, exposed to the random cruelties of weather and failing infrastructure. Without that silent, flashing pulse of light, the studio space collapsed back into a claustrophobic concrete box. He looked at the empty logging sheets before him, realizing with a cold pang of clarity how deeply his entire sense of purpose had become anchored to a person he had never seen, a voice he had never actually heard. The silence in the room was no longer a comforting sanctuary, it was an aggressive, suffocating weight that measured the precise depth of his isolation. Miles away, standing in the dark entry vestibule of the conservatory, Diana stared in frustration at the wall-mounted vintage telephone box. The receiver was pressed hard against her ear, but the line was completely dead, producing nothing but a rhythmic, metallic clicking sound, the unmistakable sign of a main line severed by ice somewhere along the valley road. Beside her, the small plastic radio sputtered with heavy distortion, Julian's broadcast fading in and out like a dying pulse through a wall of static. She lowered the receiver back onto its heavy brass cradle with a slow, heavy hand. The creative confidence that had bloomed under the influence of the nightly music felt suddenly unmoored. She walked back into the main aisle of the greenhouse, where the emerald and amber light still painted the leaves, but without the accompanying soundtrack, the colors looked artificial, detached from any deeper meaning. She knelt in the dirt, her fingers curling into the damp soil, feeling a profound, aching melancholy as she realized that her beautiful, glass-enclosed world was once again entirely alone in the dark. Chapter 14, The Blueprint and the Needle. The morning mail arrived at the radio station in a battered canvas sack, bringing with it the standard assortment of technical bills, promotional records from commercial studios, and listener correspondence. Julian sat at the side desk in the main lobby at 4 p.m., his eyes heavy from another long night of searching through the static. He filtered through the stack of envelopes with a detached, mechanical movement until his hand brushed against something unusual, a long, heavy cardboard tube, sealed with thick wax and wrapped in coarse brown paper. There was no return address, no printed label, and no personal name. The only identifying mark was a small, hand-drawn musical staff on the paper exterior, containing the exact 5-note melody from the midnight music box. Julian's heart gave a sudden, violent thud against his ribs. His fingers trembled slightly as he sliced through the wax seal with his pocketknife and tipped the tube forward. A thick sheet of heavy, high-grade drafting paper slid out onto the wooden table, unrolling to reveal an intricate, highly detailed architectural blueprint of a grand conservatory. The drawing was a masterpiece of precise, elegant ink work, fine lines detailing the iron framework, the curved glass panels, and the sprawling layout of interior plant beds. Julian leaned over the desk, his eyes tracking the fluid, circular arrangements of paths that looked exactly like a musical composition translated into structure. In the margins, the artist had sketched miniature botanical details, winter jasmines, dormant ferns, and clusters of rare orchids. But what caught Julian's attention was a small, distinct smudge of dark, dried greenhouse soil on the bottom right corner of the page. It was the exact same texture and color he had seen on the cuff of the woman's canvas jacket at the coffee cart days before. He traced the fine ink lines with the tip of his finger, a profound wave of understanding washing over him. The anonymous voice in his headphones, the woman who had dropped her plans in the market, and the beautiful stranger from the espresso queue were all the same person. She wasn't an abstract ghost floating through the radio waves, she was a real, breathing force of nature trying to build something magnificent in the heart of the winter. He took the blueprint into the broadcast booth, pinning it directly to the acoustic corkboard above his main mixing console. As he prepared his vinyl records for the upcoming shift, his eyes kept returning to the structured lines of her garden. The isolation that had suffocated him during the previous night's static vanished entirely, replaced by a fierce, creative determination. He had her map now, and he knew exactly how to build the soundtrack to match it. Chapter 15, Walking the Same Streets. The city in mid-December resembled an intricate maze of stone and ice, its avenues carved through frozen embankments of piled snow. Along the concrete promenade that flanked the gray, sluggish river, the winter wind swept over the dark water, carrying a bitter, damp chill that forced the few brave pedestrians to bury their faces in heavy scarves. At 11 a.m., Julian walked along this desolate path, his boots leaving crisp, isolated impressions in the thin crust of frost that coated the stone walkway. He stopped near an ancient, black iron bridge pier, his eyes fixed on the slow movement of the river ice below. His mind was drifting through the geometric lines of the blueprint currently pinned inside his booth, trying to visualize the physical space where those delicate orchids and towering ferns existed. He leaned against the icy stone balustrade for several long minutes, absorbing the melancholy beauty of the gray sky and the skeletal trees, completely detached from the occasional passing car on the upper roadway, before turning back toward the city center to prepare for his evening resting hours. Exactly 3 hours later, the pale afternoon sun cast a faint, golden sheen over the exact same spot along the river wall. Diana walked down the promenade, her heavy canvas bag filled with small, specialized brass misting nozzles she had gathered from a downtown supplier. She stopped at the very same iron pier, her gloved hand resting on the cold stone where Julian's sleeve had brushed only hours before. She looked out at the same shifting blocks of river ice, her thoughts heavy with the logistical pressures of the upcoming grand opening. The freezing fog had cleared, but the lingering dampness in the air reminded her of the fragile atmosphere inside her glass fortress. She watched a lone seagull fight the northern draft above the bridge, finding a strange comfort in the bird's solitary resilience. They were navigating the exact same geographic coordinates, reading the same visual cues of the winter landscape, yet existing on entirely different temporal planes. The stone steps, the iron railings, and the frozen river acted as a shared canvas for their separate solitudes. Diana pulled her coat tighter, unaware that the faint scent of wood smoke and chicory lingering near the bench belonged to the man who had occupied her thoughts all morning. She turned away from the river, heading back toward the northern edge of the city where the conservatory lights were waiting to be activated. The city continued its frantic, noisy rush toward the holiday, completely blind to the fact that these two parallel lives were carving identical paths through the winter stone, their trajectories inching closer with every passing hour. Chapter 16, Elena's Intervention. The late afternoon light inside the conservatory had grown thin and brittle, casting long, pale gray shadows that stretched across the rows of budding white amaryllis. Diana remained hunched over her low drafting table, her shoulders drawn tight beneath her heavy wool cardigan, her fingers clutching a mechanical pencil with a white-knuckled intensity. A scattering of crumpled tracing papers littered the floor around her stool, discarded ideas for the central floral archway that still refused to anchor properly in her mind. Her eyes were bloodshot, tracking the erratic, tiny movements of her hands as she tried to force a complex drainage calculation onto the page. Elena stood by the glass entrance doors, quietly observing her friend's frantic, circular energy. She saw the dangerous level of physical and creative exhaustion creeping into Diana's posture, the slight tremor in her hands, the rhythmic, anxious tapping of her boot against the iron floor grating, and the way she entirely ignored the cold mug of tea that had sat untouched since noon. Without a word, Elena stepped forward into the quiet aisle, her boots making a soft, deliberate thud on the damp soil to signal her approach. She didn't offer a supportive pat or try to gently pry the pencil away. Instead, she performed a series of calm, systematic actions that brooked no argument. First, she reached over and clicked the master switch of the drafting lamp, plunging the immediate workspace into the soft, dim violet twilight of the natural evening. Then, she walked to the corner hook, pulled Diana's heavy canvas winter coat from its peg, and held it open directly in front of the drafting table like a silent, waiting shadow. Diana froze, her mechanical pencil hovering centimeters above an unfinished line, her face tightening with a brief flash of defensive frustration as she looked up at her friend. Elena didn't blink. She simply tilted her head toward the distant, glowing skyline of the city center, where the first faint sounds of brass music and the warm, golden light of the annual winter festival were beginning to pierce the freezing fog. It was a wordless directive, a command born of a decade of shared labor. The drawings could wait, the plants would survive the evening, but the architect was on the verge of breaking. Elena stepped forward, gently laying a pair of thick, insulated leather mittens on top of the unfinished blueprint, then gestured firmly toward the exit. Diana stared at the mittens for a long, heavy moment, the creative panic in her chest slowly giving way to a deep, exhausting realization that her friend was entirely right. She stood up, her joints popping softly in the quiet greenhouse, and slid her arms into the heavy coat, allowing Elena to guide her out into the crisp, biting night air, away from the glass fortress that had become both her masterpiece and her prison. Chapter 17, The Festival Crowd. The central historic square had been transformed into a brilliant, swirling constellation of golden holiday lights, rising like a warm vapor against the black December sky. Hundreds of citizens moved through the narrow pathways between the wooden chalets, their breath forming a collective, glowing cloud over the crowd. The air was thick with the rich, comforting aromas of melting cheese, spiced cinnamon cider, and the sharp, resinous scent of fresh-cut pine garlands draped over every stall. Julian moved slowly through this dense sea of humanity, a heavy leather strap holding his portable field recorder tight against his chest. He wore professional, noise-isolating headphones over his ears, connected to a long, foam-covered shotgun microphone that he held aloft to capture the unique, chaotic soundscape of the seasonal celebration, the rhythmic, metallic grinding of a vintage wooden carousel, the sudden bursts of children's laughter, the warm clinking of heavy ceramic mugs, and the steady, collective shuffle of thousands of winter boots moving across the packed snow. Through the sensitive microphones, the world became a hyper-detailed tapestry of acoustic textures, allowing him to observe the joy of the holiday while remaining completely detached from it behind his wall of technology. He stood near the center of the square, where a massive bonfire roared in an iron brazier, its bright orange sparks flying upward into the cold night. As he adjusted the gain dials on his recorder, a sudden shift in the crowd's movement caught his eye. Emerging from the shadow of a gingerbread chalet just 20 feet away was Diana, her face illuminated by the flickering orange glow of the fire. She was walking slowly, her hands buried deep inside her coat pockets, her expression a mixture of sensory overload and quiet contemplation as she let the warm energy of the festival wash over her tired mind. Julian froze, the recording microphone dipping slightly in his hand. His headphones picked up the sudden, distinct sound of a woman's sharp intake of breath as she paused to admire a display of hand-carved wooden ornaments nearby. He stared across the shifting gap of people, his heart hammering against his ribs as he recognized the intense, beautiful face from the coffee cart and the market square. The golden festival lights danced across her dark hair, making her look entirely real and heartbreakingly close. Diana, sensing a sudden stillness in the air around her, turned her head toward the bonfire. Her eyes swept across the crowd, locking instantly onto the tall man with the gray scarf and the heavy recording gear. For several long seconds, they stood suspended in the middle of the frantic holiday rush, two solitary planets aligning for a brief, silent moment while the rest of the world spun loudly around them. Chapter 18, The Sound of a Glove. The momentary silence that had suspended Julian and Diana in the middle of the crowded square shattered as a large tour group, boisterous and laden with shopping bags, surged directly between them. The physical barrier of heavy wool coats and laughter severed their line of sight, forcing Julian to step backward against the wooden railing of a pastry stall to protect his delicate recording equipment. Through his headphones, the acoustic landscape exploded with the close-range rustle of nylon and the clatter of ceramic mugs. He frantically raised his eyes, searching over the heads of the crowd, but the dark hair and the canvas coat had already vanished into the swirling, golden-lit currents of the festival market. As he lowered his shotgun microphone, intending to follow the direction she had been facing, his foot brushed against something soft on the packed, icy snow. He knelt down, his fingers closing around a small, elegant winter glove made of deep forest green velvet. It was a beautiful, artisanal object, lined with soft cream silk, still holding the faint, residual warmth of the hand that had worn it. He lifted it close to his face, breathing in a distinct, subtle scent that cut through the heavy festival odors of roasted nuts and hot wine, the sharp, earthy fragrance of damp peat moss, crushed pine needles, and fresh winter jasmine. It was the unmistakable olfactory signature of the Grand Conservatory. Julian stood up quickly, clutching the green velvet glove tightly in his hand, and thrust his way through the dense crowd toward the northern exit of the square. He scanned every face beneath the glittering holiday arches, his heart hammering against his ribs, but the daylight city had swallowed her once again. He walked slowly back toward the radio station, his fingers tracing the delicate stitching of the velvet fabric inside his pocket. He hadn't found her, but he was no longer holding an anonymous blueprint or a phantom echo from a telephone wire. He possessed a physical piece of her reality. The green glove was a tangible promise, a structural anchor for his nightly broadcasts, proving that the silent architect of the night was moving closer to his world with every freezing tick of the clock. Chapter 19, The Winter Solstice Broadcast. The night of December 21st arrived with a deep, crushing stillness, bringing the longest hours of darkness the city would face all year. The thermometer outside the high window of wavelengths 94.2 had plunged far below zero, freezing the thick moisture on the glass into intricate, fern-like geometric patterns. Inside the master control room, Julian sat bathed in the familiar, dim orange glow of the audio console. The green velvet glove sat on the flat metal housing of the secondary turntable, a small, vibrant token of reality amid the cold plastic and steel of his nocturnal sanctuary. At precisely 3 a.m., he began his special solstice broadcast, a 4-hour continuous soundscape curated specifically for the distant glass pyramid that haunted his thoughts. He didn't speak a single word into the microphone. Instead, he let his heavy, gloved fingers lower the diamond stylus into the first track, a rare, unreleased recording of an acoustic cello mimicking the slow, steady rhythm of deep, underground growth. Miles away, sitting in the absolute darkness of the conservatory's central aisle, Diana leaned her back against the rough bark of an indoor cedar tree. Her bare left hand was buried deep inside her pocket, but her right hand was encased in a single green velvet glove, her thumb tracing the smooth seam where its twin should have been. The small plastic radio on the soil sack beside her hummed with an unprecedented, crystal-clear warmth. The freezing solstice air seemed to have purged the frequencies of all atmospheric static. As the cello's resonant notes vibrated through the humid glasshouse, she closed her eyes, letting the music wash over her exhausted limbs. It was followed immediately by a field recording Julian had captured at the festival, the crackle of the great bonfire, the soft, distant murmur of the crowd, and then, a long, intentional loop of a single, sharp intake of breath. Diana's heart gave a sudden, violent leap in her chest. She pulled her gloved hand from her pocket, staring at the fabric in the faint silver moonlight. It was her own breath, recorded in the market square. She knew instantly, with a profound and dizzying clarity, that the man with the recording gear at the festival, the man who had caught her blueprint in the snow, and the midnight operator of the turntable were all the same solitary soul. The music shifted again, transitioning into a beautiful, swelling arrangement of solo harp and natural wind, matching the exact tempo of the lights she had designed for her winter plans. Julian was playing her blueprint back to her through the airwaves, using the longest night of the year to weave their separate worlds into a single, unbreakable fabric of sound and shadow, anchoring her heart securely ahead of the chaotic dawn that awaited them. Chapter 20, The Christmas Eve Preparation. The morning of December 23rd arrived with a frantic, industrial energy that shattered the quiet sanctuary of the conservatory. A fleet of delivery trucks lined the narrow gravel driveway, their engines idling loudly as workers in heavy leather vests began unloading wooden crates of premium soil, brass presentation stands, and rows of pristine white ribbons. Elena moved through the main entrance with a clipboard gripped firmly in her hand, her boots clicking sharply against the stone floor as she directed the laborers toward the secondary display halls. Diana stood at the center of the grand pavilion, completely engulfed by the logistical storm of her own creation. Her hands were caked in dry gray clay as she positioned the final root baskets of winter jasmine around the base of the massive central iron pillars. Her mind was a dizzying checklist of humidity calculations, light intensities, and visitor flow charts, yet beneath the immediate layer of professional panic, her thoughts remained anchored to the steady, resonant frequency of the previous night's solstice broadcast. As the afternoon sun reached its lowest, pale amber point over the glass roof, Diana stepped away from the bustling crew, wiping her hands on her canvas apron. She walked slowly back to her quiet drafting table, which had been cleared of all tracing papers to make room for the official exhibition programs. From the top drawer, she pulled a small, elegant card made of heavy, cream-colored cotton paper, the very first VIP invitation to the Christmas Eve preview gala, stamped with a gold-embossed orchid leaf. She turned it over and, using a thick calligraphy pen, carefully drew the 5-note music box melody across the back of the envelope, followed by the single room number of the conservatory's central pavilion. She didn't write a name, an address, or a signature. The ink notation was a definitive, unambiguous beacon meant for only one person in the entire city. She wrapped the invitation inside a small piece of dark green silk ribbon, matching the texture of her missing velvet glove, and handed the package to a reliable courier who was departing for the downtown media district. 2 hours later, the small envelope sat on the dark mahogany reception counter of wavelengths 94.2, nestled between a stack of commercial magazines and the evening transmission logs. Julian discovered it when he arrived for his early prep shift, his eyes locking instantly onto the hand-drawn musical staff. As his fingers closed around the thick cotton paper, the frantic noise of the afternoon newsroom faded into a profound, focused silence. The blueprint had shown him her world, the glove had given him her reality, and now, this single card provided him with a specific time and place to finally step out from behind the safety of his microphones. Chapter 21, The Final Set. The master clock on the studio wall read 3 a.m. on the morning of Christmas Eve, its red digital numbers casting a rhythmic, bloody pulse across the silent audio console. This was Julian's final live broadcast before the station switched over to its automated, pre-recorded holiday music loops for the long weekend. The atmosphere inside the control room felt uniquely solemn, almost sacred. The cream-colored invitation card sat propped perfectly against the base of his primary microphone, the gold-embossed orchid leaf catching the amber glow of the console lights. Julian's fingers moved over the mixing board with a deliberate, slow precision, sliding up the master faders one last time to claim the midnight frequencies. He felt a strange, profound sense of finality. For weeks, this dark room had been his entire universe, a fortress of sound where he could hide from the vulnerabilities of the daylight world. But looking at the hand-drawn musical notes on the envelope, he knew the era of shadows and anonymous echoes was drawing to an absolute close. For the centerpiece of this final set, Julian reached into his canvas bag and pulled out the ancient, hand-cut acetate disc that Arthur had recovered from the sub-basement vaults. He carefully placed the heavy wax onto the transcription platter, wiping the surface with a lint-free velvet cloth with a slow, reverent motion. When the diamond stylus met the first groove, the airwaves did not fill with a standard holiday melody. Instead, the crystalline, raw notes of the solo harp and the haunting sighing of the vintage night wind cascaded out over the city. Julian manually adjusted the equalizer dials, pulling out the harsh midtones and boosting the warm, low frequencies until the sound possessed a deep, physical resonance that felt like a living heartbeat. He then took the green velvet glove from his pocket and laid it gently over the unused microphone capsule, a silent gesture of surrender to the frequency. He let the record loop twice, allowing the fragile, textured music to stretch across the silent miles of frozen stone and concrete, an unmistakable, definitive confirmation of his arrival. Miles away, inside the dark glass pyramid of the conservatory, Diana sat completely motionless on a wooden bench beneath the central pavilion. The small plastic radio beside her hummed with a pure, unclouded clarity, the harp music filling the humid air and vibrating through the delicate, velvety leaves of the surrounding white orchids. She looked down at her right hand, which was encased in the single matching green velvet glove she had kept, her fingers curling tightly as she absorbed the deep, emotional weight of the broadcast. The repetition of this specific historic record was the message she had been waiting for, a wordless, beautiful acceptance of her invitation. The music didn't just fill her garden, it validated every hour of creative isolation, every frantic sketch, and every cold night spent in the dirt. She looked up through the towering glass panes at the starry, black sky, knowing that the long, parallel journeys through the winter dark were finally coming to an end, and that when the sun rose again, the airwaves would fall silent, but the physical world would finally begin. Chapter 22, The Central Pavilion. The Grand Conservatory on Christmas Eve resembled a massive, floating lantern of crystal and gold, its brilliant light piercing the deep, velvet blackness of the winter night. Inside the main entrance, the atmosphere was thick with the elegant murmur of a sophisticated holiday crowd, the soft rustle of silk evening gowns, and the delicate clinking of crystal champagne flutes. A warm, humid current of air, heavily perfumed by hundreds of blooming white orchids and the sharp, clean scent of fresh winter jasmine, enveloped the visitors as they moved along the sweeping pathways. The lighting grid worked flawlessly, casting a soft, amber and emerald glow that turned the towering ferns and dark cedar branches into an otherworldly landscape of color and shadow. Elena stood near the reception archway, looking sleek in a dark wool blazer, her eyes keeping a watchful, professional track on the arriving dignitaries and art critics, ensuring the logistical flow remained completely seamless. Julian entered the glass fortress at exactly 8:15 p.m., his tall frame clad in a clean, dark tailored coat, the familiar gray scarf replaced by the stark collar of a formal white shirt. He didn't stop to mingle with the crowd or sample the catering trays. Instead, his eyes locked onto the physical architecture of the building, immediately recognizing the sweeping curves and precise pathways from the hand-inked blueprint that had sat pinned above his mixing console for days. He walked with a slow, deliberate step, following the exact geometric layout of the design, feeling a profound, dizzying sensation as the two-dimensional ink lines came to life around him in three-dimensional wood, iron, and stone. His right hand remained buried deep inside his coat pocket, his fingers firmly gripping the soft, cream silk lining of the missing green velvet glove. He crossed beneath a towering archway of woven pine boughs and stepped into the absolute center of the grand pavilion. There, standing on a low stone dais beside a massive iron support pillar wrapped in budding winter jasmines, was Diana. She wore a simple, elegant dark green dress that matched the deep color of the conservatory foliage, her dark hair pinned back with a simple silver clip. She was looking away from the crowd, her eyes fixed on the glass roof where the silver moon was sliding into view. Julian stopped 10 feet away, his boots making a soft, distinct crunch on the fine gravel path. Sensing the sudden change in the air, Diana turned her head slowly. Her breath caught in her throat as her eyes locked onto the sharp jawline and deep, calm eyes of the stranger from the coffee cart and the marketplace. The bustling noise of the holiday gala seemed to drop away entirely, replaced by a profound, reverent silence that belonged only to them. Julian walked the remaining steps toward the dais, pulled his hand from his pocket, and gently extended the forest green velvet glove toward her. Diana looked down at the token, a beautiful, radiant smile slowly illuminating her tired face. She reached out with her right hand, which was already encased in a single matching glove, and allowed him to slip the missing fabric onto her left fingers. Their gloved hands clasped together, their fingers interlocking over the gold-embossed orchid card she had sent him. There were no explanations needed, no words spoken, and no introductions required. The airwaves had fallen silent for the weekend, but standing together in the warm, fragrant heart of her creation, their parallel winter journeys had finally fused into a single, beautiful reality. Chapter 23, The Silent Symphony of Dawn. The chaotic energy of the Christmas Eve gala had long since evaporated, leaving the grand conservatory wrapped in a deep, crystalline post-holiday stillness as the clock drifted past 4 a.m. on Christmas morning. Outside, a fresh layer of fine, powdery snow began to fall, dusting the immense glass panels of the pyramid roof with a soft, insulating blanket that further muted the distant sounds of the city sleeping below. Inside, the brilliant festival spotlights had been turned off, replaced by the faint, ethereal silver of the winter moon casting long, skeletal shadows of palm fronds and iron trusses across the flagstone paths. Julian and Diana sat side by side on a low stone bench near the central jasmine archway, their coats pulled tight against the subtle chill that always managed to seep through the perimeter glass in the deepest hours of the morning. Their gloved hands remained firmly interlocked between them on the cold stone, a steady, warm anchor connecting their separate histories. On the wooden crate beside them, the small plastic radio continued to emit a faint, steady hiss of dead air. The live broadcast studio upstairs at wavelengths 94.2 was entirely dark, the automated holiday system merely feeding a low, imperceptible hum through the local frequencies. Yet, the silence between them didn't feel empty, it possessed a rich, textured depth that didn't require the mediation of microphones, vinyl grooves, or telephone wires. Julian turned his head slowly, his gray scarf shifting as he watched the soft, rhythmic rise and fall of Diana's shoulders, noting how the faint silver moonlight caught the sharp, creative intelligence of her profile. He realized that the frantic, obsessive search through the midnight static was over. The phantom echo he had been chasing through the airwaves had finally settled into a tangible, breathing reality beside him. Diana turned her gaze away from the glass roof, her eyes meeting his with a quiet, unforced intensity that communicated more than 1,000 late-night confessions ever could. She reached out with her free hand, her fingers gently tracing the rough wool of his coat sleeve, acknowledging the physical presence of the man who had structured the soundtrack to her most isolated hours. They had spent months navigating the same frozen streets, looking at the same gray river, and responding to the same subtle shifts in the winter landscape, always separated by a few hours or a wall of glass. Now, as the first incredibly faint, pale pink lines of the Christmas dawn began to bleed into the eastern sky, illuminating the dormant white orchids around them, the parallel tracks had vanished completely. They simply sat together in the warm, fragrant heart of the silent greenhouse, watching the darkness slowly recede, entirely content to let the physical world rewrite itself around them in perfect, wordless synchronization. Chapter 24, The Boxing Day Routine. The festive warmth of Christmas Day dissolved into the stark, practical gray of Boxing Day morning. At 7:30 a.m., the city reawoke to its familiar, mechanical rhythms, the distant rumble of early delivery trucks and municipal salt spreaders grinding through the slush on the avenues below. Inside Julian's third-floor apartment, the light was weak and bluish, filtering through narrow windows that overlooked a labyrinth of fire escapes and snow-draped clotheslines. For years, this space had been arranged as a strict solitary bunker, a small wooden kitchen table pulled tight against the radiator, a single ceramic mug drying on the rack, and stacks of vintage jazz journals acting as a makeshift barrier between his sleeping quarters and the rest of the world. Today, however, the quiet geometry of the room had subtly, irreversibly shifted. A second plate sat on the worn oak tabletop, holding a thick slice of dense rye bread and a small block of salted butter. Diana sat across from him, her thick wool cardigan wrapped tightly around her frame, her dark hair gathered into a loose, unstudied knot at the nape of her neck. Spread out between their coffee cups was a heavy, leather-bound ledger, the conservatory's climate and growth log for the final week of December. Her fingers, still carrying the faint, dark trace of soil beneath the nails from her late-night checks, moved methodically down the columns of figures, tracking the internal humidity percentages and root zone temperatures of the tropical fern pavilion. Julian sat quietly beside her, his long fingers wrapped around a steaming mug of black chicory coffee, his eyes tracking the fluid, rapid motion of her pencil as she made minor adjustments to the heating schedule. There was no sound in the kitchen save for the rhythmic clanking of the old iron radiator, the scraping of graphite on heavy paper, and the soft, comforting rustle of her sleeve against the wood. The intense, dramatic isolation that had defined their midnight interactions on the airwaves had settled into a calm, domesticated reality. They did not need to fill the morning with a sudden rush of spoken explanations or retrospective confessions. The shared silence that had once driven them to search through the radio static now felt completely natural, an expansive space where their parallel lives could run side by side without friction. Julian reached out, his hand moving over the edge of the ledger to gently adjust the position of the butter dish, his knuckles brushing against hers for a fleeting second. Diana did not look up from her data, but a faint, relaxed softness settled into the corners of her mouth, a silent acknowledgement that the solitary night shifts were finally over, and the quiet work of building a shared daylight routine had begun. Chapter 25, The Broadcast Vault. The afternoon light of late December was fading fast as Julian led Diana down the narrow, winding iron staircase into the deepest sub-basement vaults of wavelengths 94.2. The air down here belonged to a completely different era, thick with the nostalgic scent of decaying cardboard sleeves, iron filings, and ancient record wax. It was a subterranean maze of towering steel industrial shelves, holding thousands of uncatalogued shellac discs and thick acetate transcriptions that hadn't seen the sun in decades. Arthur stood near the back of the third row, a heavy brass flashlight tucked under his arm, his calloused hands carefully wiping down the housing of a vintage 1950s cutting lathe. As their boots clicked softly against the concrete floor, the old engineer looked up, his weathered face breaking into a slow, knowing smile that crinkled the corners of his eyes. He didn't speak, nor did he demand an introduction. He simply gave Diana a deep, respectful nod of welcome, acknowledging the silent architect who had finally stepped out of the airwaves and into his realm of wires and iron. Arthur reached onto a nearby wooden workbench and picked up a heavy, freshly polished acetate disc, holding it out toward Julian with a steady, reverent hand. Julian accepted the record, his fingers instantly recognizing the smooth, hand-cut edge. He laid it gently onto a nearby listening station turntable, guiding Diana close so she could see the faint, elegant inscription freshly etched into the center wax near the spindle, "The color of tomorrow." He manually lifted the heavy tone arm, his movements carrying the practiced, rhythmic grace of a man who had dedicated his life to the mechanical precision of sound. When the diamond needle dropped into the first deep groove, a faint, warm crackle filled the small alcove, followed immediately by a beautifully complex arrangement of solo acoustic guitar and low, resonant cello chords that seemed to mimic the slow, steady pulse of a city waking up after a long winter storm. Diana stepped closer to Julian, her arm brushing against the rough wool of his dark coat as the music enveloped them in the quiet basement. She looked from the spinning black disc up to his face, her eyes reflecting the soft, amber glow of the turntable's indicator bulb. She reached out, her bare hand sliding into his, her fingers interlocking with his long fingers with a familiar, confident warmth. They stood together in the heart of the archive, surrounded by the forgotten echoes of the past, while creating the first tangible notes of their own future. The melody was hopeful, rich with emotional texture, yet it possessed a lingering, experimental cadence that didn't rush toward a conventional resolution. It was a beautiful, expansive sound that left plenty of room for interpretation, mirroring the vast, unwritten landscape of the days ahead. As the music continued to play, drifting upward through the iron stairs toward the empty broadcast booths above, they turned together toward the exit, ready to walk back out into the crisp, twilight air of the city, leaving the exact destination of their journey entirely unmapped, but entirely together.